So there's a big conversation going on around reparations at the moment. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates had a big piece in The Atlantic about it. Brett Weinstein talks about he's not a fan of reparations, but he does believe that some kind of investment into black neighborhoods to make up for histories of disadvantage should be considered. Do you agree with either of those perspectives?
The question presumes that we haven't already done that. This thing happened called the Civil Rights Revolution. We had the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, Community Reinvestment Act. We've had set-aside programs for decades that specifically target minority business owners for lucrative government contracts. We have diversity and inclusion programs that redound to the benefit of people of color in virtually every sector of the labor market. The idea that we haven't yet targeted black people with race-conscious policy meant to uplift Black America, and that we're now considering whether to start, is absolutely ludicrous. We have an entire networks and bureaucracies that are self-sustaining, that seek to that were created in essence to pay black people back for slavery and Jim Crow. So it's not a question of whether to start doing race-conscious policy. We've had that for decades. Part of the reason I think that it gets framed that way is because we haven't seen as much progress in reducing disparities as people expected to. So what happens is you implement some great new race-conscious program that's gonna uplift black people. 20 years later, you see that the black-white gap in whatever relevant area has remained the same. And then after the fact, you say, well, we haven't really done anything. And it's like, wait, no, you're just saying that now because the policy you proposed actually didn't work. So one thing I would say is, again, disparities are normal. It's actually like no one is losing any sleep over the 21-cent household income gap between French Americans and Russian Americans. We're only losing sleep over similar types of disparities between blacks and whites. And we should interrogate why it is that we're losing sleep over the one and not the other. Really why. And don't just say slavery and Jim Crow. Go deeper than that. Because I'm sure you could tell a historical story about why the French and the Russians aren't at perfect parity. And B, we need a conceptual change in the way we understand what progress entails. Does progress entail equal outcomes? Well, not really. And this may seem a glib point, but you could easily get equal outcomes just by making the people who are doing better do worse. Like, take some income away from Asian Americans so that they're earning as much as white Americans, and you've made progress. And then take income away from both so that blacks, whites, and Asians are all making the same amount of income. And now we've achieved parity. Isn't the world better? Well, no, you've just made a lot of people poorer. That's it. So the way we should conceptualize progress should allow for different groups that have some disparity, say blacks and whites, to both make progress without the disparity necessarily having to collapse, because disparities don't always collapse, right? And that's not an indictment of society when they don't.
And I mean, you kind of hinted at the idea of unintended consequences there. And you had a really interesting example of that in the Sam Harris podcast, I think, in affirmative action and what happened in California. Mm-hmm. Can you outline that?
Well, yeah, this is what's been called the mismatch theory or the mismatch effect, which is when you take an 18-year-old black high school graduate and you apply affirmative action to their application, which is to say you put them in a much more competitive school than they otherwise would have gotten into at their level of preparedness. What you're doing, in effect, is putting them in the bottom 10% of preparedness at a top school, where they might have been at the 50th percentile if they were a white applicant at a different school. So I believe his name is Richard Sander, is the UCLA law professor who wrote the book on this. But basically what happens are a few things. You're more likely to drop out because you're struggling in every class. And it's not for lack of intelligence, it's just for a mismatch between your level of preparedness and the school, specifically the student pool that you're part of. You're more likely to switch to less rigorous majors. So I believe there was a study at Duke University that showed the amount of black kids who came into Duke wanting to study rigorous majors like economics, but then defecting to far less rigorous majors like African American studies. And then if you look at the amount of whites that came in wanting to do economics, far fewer dropped out into less rigorous majors. So that's an adverse consequence that doesn't get talked about much, but is concerning and certainly is a side effect of affirmative action, which is supposedly this policy that is so important for uplifting black people, and if it were gutted, we would just be sending America back to the 1950s, and yet has shown remarkably little progress in the 50 some odd years that it's been around.
But what I understood is that they abolished it in California and then they saw the grades rise or more success.
That's right. Yeah, they abolished it in either 1994 or 1996. And there were doomsayers who said this is going to set black people back. It actually didn't. It narrowed the test score gap at many UC schools. UC San Diego, I think, the GPA gap between blacks and whites virtually disappeared, which makes sense. Which makes sense because now the students admitted to UC San Diego in a colorblind fashion were on par with the 50th percentile student that goes there, rather than being rather than getting someone who would do pretty well at a somewhat lesser school and shuttling them into that more competitive environment where they're being set up for failure.
And what do you think are the most compelling comparisons or examples to make to illustrate the points that you're trying to make?
Yeah, so there are several examples throughout history of groups of people that experienced enormous levels of oppression, and not only did they nevertheless achieve at what would be seen as a high level of success, but at a higher level of success than the groups that oppressed them. So one example I often use are Japanese Americans who came to this country in the first wave of Japanese immigration as illiterate peasants in the early 20th century. There were laws on the books in 13 or 14 states called the Alien Land Laws that prevented them from owning property until 1952, when those laws were ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. By 1960, Japanese people had a higher rate of college attainment than white people, than white Americans. So, I mean, that's one example. I could also give the example of West Indian and African immigrants in the United States who, there haven't been many studies on this, but from Douglas Massey's study and from Lonnie Guinier and Henry Louis Gates' study in the early 2000s, we know anywhere from 40% to 2/3 of the black students at Ivy League colleges are West Indian immigrants, African immigrants, or their children. That cohort only makes up 10% of the US black population, so they're massively overrepresented at the highest levels of achievement. And yet, certainly in the case of West Indians, this is a group that was formerly enslaved. So what happens, the reason I could say similar things about Jewish Americans as well. The reason I bring these examples up is to combat the lazy assumption that sees a group lagging today behind the majority ethnic group sees that that group has also been oppressed throughout history and assumes that the oppression is the main cause of the lagging. You can make the point in the opposite direction as well. There are groups that do lag behind without having necessarily a historical reason to lag behind. So there's a point where Puerto Ricans in New York City had lower incomes than blacks in New York City, despite having been a recent wave of voluntary immigration. They didn't have the history of slavery in the US to point to as a reason. They came here voluntarily, unlike black people, and yet showed similar patterns of single-parent homes, crime. You could say much the same about the Irish when they first came, the Italians when they first came. They sometimes had murder rates that were 5 times the rate of, say, German Americans. And they didn't necessarily have the history of oppression to blame it on. So I'm trying to, the common thread here is that there's a lazy assumption of causation where it may not be the case.